Let's start with three of the New Deal works that are in the exhibition. The first is a mural by Leo Rakin showing a Rhode Island rock quarry, and that is on your left. In the middle is a painting by Virginia Woolley showing a hydroelectric station in Georgia. And the last is a color lithograph by Beatrice Mandelman showing the entrance to a coal-breaking plant. Before I get to my first question, I'm going to ask your indulgence to let me say just a few words about what we're talking about when we talk about New Deal art. And Lee looked at me like I was crazy when I said I was going to do this. But I will be very brief. Each of these works was produced under a different agency of the federal government during the New Deal. Virginia Woolley's painting, for example, was created for the Public Works of Art Project, a very short-lived work relief program for artists. The Public Works of Art Project was superseded in 1935 by the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The WPA employed all kinds of people to build schools and hospitals, to dig ditches, to pave sidewalks, and do 100 other different kinds of things. Among those employed were artists who were hired by local art centers to practice their art and to teach as well. Beatrice Mandelman made this print while working for the WPA in New York City. So these were jobs. You got there in the morning, you punched in, you did your work, you punched out, and you drew a regular paycheck. The most prominent or best known works from the New Deal were not produced by the WPA, though. They came from the Treasury Department, which commissioned artists to paint murals for US government buildings, and that ranged from the gigantic office buildings in Washington, D.C., like the Justice Department and the Interior Department, to federal courthouses in cities across the country, to post offices in hundreds of cities and towns all around the United States. And you can find one of these murals just up the street from us in the Miami Beach post office. And that's the genesis of the murals that you see here by Leo Rakin. Many times people call these WPA murals, but they're not. They were produced for the Treasury Department. So I'll get to my question now. None of these works is a depiction of what is sometimes called an unspoiled landscape free of human intervention. Can you talk about how these three works offer perspectives on the relationship between human beings and the natural world, and how these perspectives might reflect broader priorities of the New Deal?
Sure. You want me to go? Okay. Just again, thank you, John, for the nice words of introduction, and Lee, it's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight at your perhaps final public appearance as a curator at the Wolfsonian. And Lee, you know, we met back in the long ago, over 35 years ago. We've been working on the Wolfsonian collection, so it really is an honor. And thank you all for being here tonight. To answer your question, when we spoke in order to prepare for this presentation, we were looking at the works in the exhibition upstairs, and we were particularly struck by these three because of how they differ in their representation of landscape with people, or in the case of the one at the center, the Virginia Woolley, without people. And so I think what it reflects are two big ideas. One is that some of the works, like the section of fine arts murals that were commissioned by the Treasury Department, really did have a purpose. And so they were juried, selected, and they had to meet a certain set of requirements, but also a thematic that would have been presented to the artists who competed for the commission. So I think that already gives the mural work a different character. The other two, we believe, are just artworks, one an easel painting and one a lithograph. And so I think you see there something that's much more about a personal interpretation of the land. And, you know, it's not clear, as with all art history and interpretive texts, we don't really know precisely what the artists were thinking, but we certainly can infer that they were part of this moment where looking at the built environment, which was so important for the economic development of America industry during that time period. So even though those were personal works, I think that was the step forward, what they wanted to put forward.
Absolutely, and that leads in really well to a little bit of a deep dive onto Leo Rakin's The Rock Quarry, which is this large mural that I hope you've all seen up on the 6th floor. And this was something, a very interesting process that happened. In this particular case, Leo Rakin submitted his design for the Westerly, Rhode Island post office, but he was not selected. You go to in a serendipitous move, a work by Paul Sample, who's also included in the exhibition upstairs, if you go to the next one, was selected. And it was this image of this sort of modernist bridge over the railroad tracks, and the people of Westerly were incensed. It did not represent their local community, which was largely founded on the economy of granite and granite quarrying. So the people of Westerly were up in arms and basically made the change that they were not going to accept this Paul Sample rendering for their post office. So as it turned out, Leo Rakin's proposal was then selected, and he continued to work on it. It was already 1941, as you see, the date of this, and this likely would have ended up right now in the Rhode Island post office, but for Pearl Harbor, which put an end to these kinds of projects. It came to a screeching halt. So you can go to the next one. But I think it's really interesting to point out that, that Leo Rakin was very familiar with granite. His father, Samuel, had established this business in Brooklyn in 1904. And then in a really sort of interesting turn of events, since the mural was never placed in the post office, it was actually on view in the storefront as part of the business for many years. Next one. So one of the great things about the collection, Mickey Wolfson always loves to acquire anything that shows the process of the artist, and we're super fortunate to have multiple studies, many more that we're going to show today, for this mural. And you can see here the studies that led up to his self-portrait as a surveyor. This is Leo Rakin himself. Next one. And then you see here also these multiple stages for a stone sander. So you see how he was thinking through the positioning of the foot and the draping of the clothing. I don't remember.
Did you want to speak about this painting?
Actually, I was going to just say one more thing about the Rakin, because a lot of people always ask, so then why? I mean, Lee explained that it wasn't installed, but a lot of people don't realize that those paintings were all done on canvases, even though the whole movement for muralism in America was influenced by the Mexican muralists, who were actually working in fresco. So the Americans kind of made it more possible, convenient, one might say, to install the murals in post offices throughout the country, and so we're fortunate to have it here in Miami. So yeah, I wanted to again take a closer look at this painting called Tallulah Falls Powerhouse by Virginia Woolley. So as you see, it was painted in 1934, and what's interesting is that again, the focus is on a power plant and a dam, a huge construction project. But the way the artist has depicted it is a kind of bucolic scene. It's all very subdued in the way it's painted, the way the light, runs across the canvas. And so again, when looking at something like the rock quarry, which is so much focused on the work that the men are doing inside this geographic location, this one gives a completely different perspective on this kind of project. And what we've learned, and again, thanks to Lee and others who do deep dives into the collection here, that the Tallulah Falls power plant was actually constructed in the early part of the 20th century. It was constructed in 1914. And that, interestingly, it was a woman who was an advocate for the power plant not being built. This is in Georgia. And so she's considered to be one of the first conservationists, environmentalists who made a stand. Of course, it was eventually built in this location, which is, as I discovered, about an hour, maybe 2 hours northeast of Atlanta. But again, why was Virginia Woolley doing this painting 20 years after this power plant was built? And so one can again maybe surmise that because of the emphasis on all of these large construction projects that were happening across the country, and in particular because of the rural electrification program that was bringing electricity throughout the South and in other rural parts of the country, that perhaps there was just an interest in looking at a construction such as this. But again, it is vacant of humans, although the effect of building this plant was able to electrify a huge part of the Southeast at that time.
Either of you want to comment on Beatrice Mandelmann's print?
Sure, go ahead. So I think this is similar in the sense that this is, again, a lithograph. It's in several colors. I think it's a 5-color lithograph. And this would have been done, as John has said, like artists would go into the studio and work, and they could choose any subject matter that they want. So we don't really know why she chose this subject, but it is about coal mining. And you do see one lone figure walking out of the frame of the artist of our view, which is interesting in and of itself. But again, it has a very soft tonality to it, so it glides over, the actual work that's being done, the work of the men in the mines, and again, as Lee mentioned with this whole exhibition that's upstairs, about what are the degradation of the environment that happened because of things like coal mining. We also have some other, Lee mentioned, I think the next slide has some states. So I believe this was an artist proof, so we have some states of the lithographic print, and again, as Lee mentioned, Mickey liked to collect those. I think what's also interesting, which I didn't say, is that they're both women artists, and I know we can maybe get into that a little more, but these federal art projects, writ large, really did try to bring in a diversity of voices, let's say. And so there were a lot of art produced by women and other minorities, and women in particular, including women who were headed up some of the agencies, like I forget her name now, Flanagan, Hallie Flanagan, who was the head of the Federal Art Project, who really made a significant contribution to theater in America during that time. So women really did kind of come out of the shadows and receive some of these commissions and projects.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask a follow-up about the 3 works that we saw. Obviously, they were all by American artists. And I'm wondering if either of you want to tackle this. Is there something particularly American about those works in the context of an exhibition that features works about the landscape from many, many countries?
Well, I think definitely so. I don't know if you agree, Marianne, but I think there really is an American aesthetic that emerges in the 30s. It's, social realism that is about sort of this optimistic move to try and tell a story that's not glorifying, but venerating workers and labor and the American spirit. There's sort of a sense of hopefulness that is attempted to be disseminated through them.
I know I can speak to John about this because years ago we both contributed to an exhibition in Germany called Art and Propaganda, and the show, the intention was to compare work during this time period from the Soviet Union and Germany and the US and Italy. And I think when you do see the works together, there are characteristics that set the American material aside, and perhaps it's the influence of American regionalism, people like Grant Wood, etc., that might, have kind of given it its visual presentation.
Yeah, I mean, the point of that exhibition was to make connections across those very different national and political contexts. So it was an attempt to be, I think, a little bit provocative by putting American and German and Soviet work side by side. But that doesn't mean that there weren't particularities in those national contexts as well. So. We have some more works by women artists. If you want to, we can advance to that and talk a little bit more about some of the women artists who made an impact during this period.
So yeah, the first one, this is Miner Joe by Elizabeth Olds. And it's this really strong image for the heroic worker. And what I found very interesting, I was able to find this lithograph to the right. So the lithograph that she created depicting Miner Joe was from 1938, and it won the first prize at the Pittsburgh Art Festival, I think, Art Fair. And then she later made it in 1942 as a serigraph. And she was actually known for teaching and disseminating the idea of silkscreen in fine art. So that's where you see how she first created this as a lithograph, and then what we own is a 1942 serigraph of this. But when I was sort of interested, because then I did another little deep dive. I was just looking in our digital catalog and looking for images of miners or mining, and was completely astounded at how many came up. There was over 30, I would say, and that's just US. I wasn't even looking at Europe at all. And I just came to realize that the iconography of the miner during the 1930s was had so much resonance. The coal miner was emblematic of the broader struggles of the working class during this period. Of course, there were many strikes that were happening during this time, labor unions that were being established. And also, coal was the primary source of energy that was driving all of the industrialization. So very, very much in the forefront of the people's minds.
Yeah, if you spend some time around this collection, you realize how central coal is to the civilization that we built, which explains how difficult the predicament we are in now is. She was also, I think, a woman of the left, and I think this kind of image of coal miners was very much connected, like you said, with the struggle of the United Mine Workers, along with the United Auto Workers to form the CIO and to unionize on an industrial scale during this time. So that's an image I think that has a kind of political charge to it, in addition just to being a nice portrait of this guy.
Yeah.
So, because of looking at the Rakin mural, we also thought about showing 2 mural studies by Ethel Magaffin. And Ethel Magaffin and her sister Jeannie, or Jenny, they both participated in several competitions for murals. But again, we were talking about women artists, but I also wanted to talk about the issue of diversity in terms of presentation of material. And in this one, as you see, it's the colored regiment at Fort Wagner, which is the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, glorified in Glory, the movie from the late 80s. And this was for a mural that was being commissioned for a building in Washington, D.C. called the Recorder of Deeds building. This did not win the competition. But again, I just wanted, when we spoke about presenting the works here, we really wanted to draw your attention to things in the artwork and not just use them as ciphers of political or economic cultural expression, but really to look at them both in terms of how they're presented, the way the structure of this image is very dynamic, that you see the movement of the troops, but also again just thinking about her choice of this the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The second piece, which is actually the one that was selected, is Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. And you see it has a very different feel to it. And again, you see here African Americans, probably enslaved and free men. And you see Andrew Jackson up on the horse, right? So he occupies the higher station in the image when the other men are below him. So there's a lot of this kind of imagery is charged with social content. And they're also landscapes, as we're here to talk about. And so I think it's interesting. What I pull out of this as a landscape is this is a sub-theme of Mickey Wolfson, the defoliated tree, which we haven't seen tonight. But the Wolfsonian has quite a large collection of defoliated trees. And again, obviously, they have meaning in this, probably the time of when this happened, but actually I'm not so sure, because I think I wrote down that the battle, no, I don't remember when the battle was. I know that the other image, the Fort Wagner image, happened in July, so we wouldn't have defoliated trees. In any event, as I said, these were opportunities that women artists received at this time, and really helped to establish careers. We could also say the same about African American and others.
Would you like to comment on this one?
I can talk a little bit about it. I don't actually know a large amount about it. Helene Sardou was a Belgian-born American artist, came here to the States when she was, I think she was 14 years old. And this piece, actually, Marianne and I were having a conversation about it yesterday, I think it was, because she had seen something that I actually hadn't seen, which was that the kneeling, the figure to the left is African American, and for some reason I had never actually seen that. And so it was interesting what you said, Marianne.
Yes, the positioning of the figures, yeah.
Yeah, so she was talking about the positioning of the figures, how of course, the figure who is the white man is at the top, and they're working in the field here. I was not able to find out anything about what this maquette would have been used for, what it was intended for, although there is a plaster of it in the collection at the Smithsonian, but no information there as well as for what it was originally going to be for.
It certainly looks like it was meant for some kind of public space.
Correct,
rather
yes.
than just a private work of art.
Right, exactly.
And potentially because well, it's too late. No, it's too late. I was going to say potentially for the World's Fair or something like that, but it's too late. Yeah. They're threshing wheat, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
It's not very big.
Yeah.
I think it's like this big.
Yeah.
It's actually in our FIU's Washington, D.C. office, so we couldn't look at it today.
Yeah, we have a lot of maquettes that look very impressive in a slide, but when you see them in person, they're a little bit diminutive. So let's.
But can I,
go ahead.
Again, so this is an agricultural scene. We haven't talked about that
Right.
Specifically, but of course there were so many images of agriculture, right? Again, this idea of the vastness of American prairie and farming culture and all of that was so important during this time period. And there's, again, in the Wolfsonian collection, so many works that show those images.
So let's jump ahead a few decades, more than a few, and talk a little bit about the legacy of these New Deal art programs. The programs that we've been talking about were created by the US government partly just in response to an emergency, to the collapse of paid work for artists during the Great Depression. But they also reflect an idea that the state should support the creation of art that expressed shared values and would be displayed in public spaces for the benefit of everyone. When you think about the art world today, what do you think we can learn from the experience of the New Deal art programs? And I'm curious, are there ways in which you think the goals of these programs, both supporting artists and commissioning art to benefit the public, are still being pursued, even if in different forms from the 1930s?
Can I just say something before specifically answering that? So in terms of how the money sort of came into communities, it really did come into communities just the way federal money comes into our community today, right? There has to be kind of a mechanism for getting the money into Miami and an organization that's then going to disseminate the funds. So that's how the program worked. And what I understood is that because this money was pouring in, states or communities could have, they'd have a theater program, and they'd have like as John mentioned, they might have a school, and they would hire artists to teach young people and others. So that's how the money was being disseminated in the communities. And once the war came and the money dried up, a lot of those organizations dried up as well. But there is, sometimes there is a glimmer of that money having seeded cultural organizations within communities.
When you think about the art that was produced during this time, is there a strong artistic legacy? Did this art kind of shape the post-war art world in the United States, or was there a departure from that?
I think there was a huge departure, as you all know, after the war, and when the American economy started to grow exponentially, we had to shift towards abstraction. But people like Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock and others worked and received funds from the federal government during this federal art program.
At the very least, it kept these artists fed who would go on to do something very different after the war.
Also, because before I came to the Wolfsonian, I worked at the Brooklyn Museum, and the Brooklyn Museum owns a suite of murals that were done for public housing called the Williamsburg Houses, and those were all abstract. So the museum was really excited to preserve them, because those were some of the very few abstract murals. They weren't for I don't think they were specifically for the art project, but they still were in a public housing in New York City.
So we should have some time for questions or comments from the audience. If you have any additional words that you'd like to say that you didn't have a chance to say, this is a good opportunity.
There was one more slide that maybe we can end on. Yeah, just one more slide. Just because it's a Miami project, these plasters were made. Many of them were made for schools all around Dade County and down in the Keys as well. And as Marianne sort of said, it's not really a landscape, but it's almost an imagined landscape in the playground with the children playing. So I just thought that was kind of a fun image to end on.
Do you know if any of them are still installed in situ?
I believe there are, yes. Yes.
And Miami Shores.
Miami Shores and Ponce.
We saw them one time with the Mickey tour.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're still around. I think, well, again, going to the post-war, right, the real legacy federally would be the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The arts was established, I think, in 1965. Of course, different time, but that's where the federal dollars come from, and places like the Wolfsonian, and right now has funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, another one of the agencies that distribute federal funds into communities. So that still exists, as you know, since the 90s. It's always been under a lot of critique about where the money's going, how it's used, et cetera, but those agencies go on. There's always threat of federal, budget cuts. Somehow they always manage to pull it back in. And as you know, we just saw here in the state of Florida that our state budget cut the majority of arts funding, if not all arts funding. Miami-Dade County's budget, people were advocating to keep the funds in the budget, but they were cut substantially. So, this is a struggle for art institutions and artists, but those do exist. My program from the Mellon Foundation, a lot of money comes through private foundations like Mellon, Getty, Guggenheim, all the names that you're familiar with, but we really do depend on them.
It seems like most of the really kind of big public pieces of art are corporate funded. You'll see them in front of a bank building or something like that, and they tend to be pretty abstract and not have the kind of explicit messaging that you see in these New Deal era murals. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you, Marianne and Lee. That was terrific. Mm-hmm.